looks like here we go. It's another day here in the study of Acts. We're all pretty excited to be here and got a lot of fun things going on today, I think. So we're going to be in Acts 26, verse 12. Start at that, end up probably around Acts 27, 12, or 13, depending on what kind of moderate south wind we get, and you'll understand that here in a few minutes or a little bit later as we go through the beginning of Paul's journey to Rome, which takes us to the final part of the book of Acts. So we are almost there. I think we have one more week after this week, and then we'll start something afresh. Actually, maybe 2 weeks. I don't know. Depends how. We'll see. Anyways, as we're here, we've gotten to the point, and just as some reminders, Paul has, as we know, appealed to Caesar, is very much confused our new governor friend Festus, who took over for Felix. And for the most part, confusing him on, well, first of all, Festus does not know a lot about Jewish faith or tradition, so that's just one mark against him. And the other side of it is he's bringing up this idea of the resurrection of the Jewish Messiah, so bringing something dead back to life again, which was foreign to most everyone, unless you're a Pharisee or Paul or these new, some of these new Christian believers. This confusion has led Festus to seek out some help from someone very interesting, King Agrippa II and his sister Bernice. We talked about them a little bit last week and who they were and why we even had that conversation with them and why that was significant. As if you remember, they were two very interesting people. Someone even said they were it was an incestual relationship, so a very, very interesting thing they had going on. Both people are power. So they were there along with the other leaders of the city, the upper crust of Caesarea, had all come together to listen to Paul and to see what Paul had to say regarding his testimony on his trip to Damascus. This is the third time that Luke has told this story here in Acts, and the third time we've seen Paul tell the story, and he's telling it a little bit differently than he did in front of his two previous audiences, just because he shapes the story, though it is the same, a little bit different as he continues to meet with other groups through other trials. From what he tells Festus and Agrippa and Bernice and everyone else listening, Festus will be able to cobble together enough information to put a letter together to send to the emperor in Rome. So when Paul gets there, he does not show up with the soldiers empty-handed, and so away they will go. We will start today with Paul providing, like I said, the third time in Acts, his journey to Damascus and his encounter with Jesus while on the road, also the Jewish Messiah. We can note, based on the audience, again, Paul will continue to tweak the story. He is not inconsistent by any stretch of the imagination. It may seem to those who have not thoroughly read the past two encounters and then read the original encounter of what happened with Paul. But more relevant, it will be to the people who are listening, such as Bernice and Agrippa. Now, Agrippa and Bernice, probably especially Agrippa, will understand the context more than, of course, Festus does. Well, then again, that's why Agrippa is there to listen, because he understands the Jewish traditions and would understand the idea of a Jewish Messiah and a resurrection. So anyways, this would be nice for him, though, Agrippa, to hear again, to kind of help give him a quick tutorial about where Paul is right now and who the Messianic Messiah is, and this relationship with the Messianic Jews. So all good stuff. We'll start with verses 12 through 18 as we work through here. And this is actually, we'll see a lot of Jesus coming into this. He'll be providing some direct dialogue from what Paul says and then what Luke writes about what Jesus said to Paul on that road to Damascus. So verse 12, while he's so engaged as I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priest, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, Who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things in which I will appear to you, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. Forgive me as I send a quick message. All right. So while Paul was on his journey to Damascus, he's able to have an encounter with Jesus. Well, he's not able to. Jesus is the one who does the encounter with him, and so he's providing this heavenly vision to Agrippa and the surrounding audience about what happens on the road to Damascus. And he's, as we know here, he is chasing down and persecuting the followers of Jesus and trying to, for the most part, arrest them and bring them back to the Jerusalem temple so that they can be persecuted and trialed and even killed, and believing have the ability to kill them martyr them, kill, either way. No, assassinate is not the right word, but kill, execute. Let's just use that word. Execute them, because the idea that they did something wrong within the temple, and when you do that, that is when bad things happen. So and the Sanhedrin and the temple leaders and the high priest had the ability, through the power of Rome, to be able to execute people for that very reason. So in this version that you read here, and if you compare it to the other two, Paul and his companions fall to the ground. This is the only time in the three versions where the kicking against goads comes up here. So this is a proverb from agricultural life. It's something that we may not be as familiar with as, say, they would be, or even people who lived in an agricultural setting. So they would understand that what Jesus was referring to. It is believed that Paul at this point probably had already started to feel guilty about the work he had been doing, possibly the Holy Spirit working on his conscience. And so he's kicking. The idea here is that he is kicking against something that is already happening. The work of Jesus is already happening. Why, Paul, or Saul here, are you continuing to kick against the goads? Why are you continuing to push against the current, fight against the current? There's many different things you could probably use to this, when what is going to happen is going to happen. So no matter what you do, the power of the resurrected Messiah is going to continue and go forth. We can possibly speculate that he may have thought Stephen may have been onto something, as there's no evidence provided by Luke, but there is some inkling that maybe his conscience was tweaked based on the words of Stephen earlier on in the book of Acts, before Stephen, of course, was martyred as Paul watched on. It seems very true, or more possibly to be true, that he believed, much like the Sanhedrin was doing, that what he was doing was consistent with what God had wanted him to do, acting against this new sect. That's the thing here, where you can't fully fault the temple high priests, or the Jewish high priest, the temple guards, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin. You can't fully fault them, because even though they had forgotten, it seems, what the Old Testament prophets had said, and were not listening to what Jesus was saying as a fulfillment of what the Old Testament prophets had said, they had dealt with many other false messiahs along the way, and false teachers along the way. And and had to deal with them in a similar manner of either killing them or removing them in some sort of harsh way. And you can remember that from evidence earlier on in this book, where there's a conversation of let these people kind of go, and we'll see what happens, because if it's true what they say, their God, or God, is going to do what he's going to do. And again, you could take this up from what Jesus is saying here. And if it's not true, the other side, then they're all going to just kind of dissipate and go away, and we don't have to worry about this again. So again, they've dealt with this time and time again. To them, it seems that they're just dealing with it all over again. But what's interesting about it is that at this time they have a Pharisee of Pharisee, Paul now, who is now on board with the messianic, the resurrected Messiah. I don't know why I was having a hard time saying that, but the resurrected Jewish Messiah at that point. Anyways, verses 16 through 18, we have Jesus speaking here. Paul provides a bit of a different version here than he was speaking at the temple courts. He does not bring up the Jewish and law-abiding Ananias, who came to Paul and helped him when he was in Damascus, back there in chapter 22, 14 through 21. Remember, he provided a little bit of background about what Ananias did for him. Instead, here he seems to focus more on what we see when Jeremiah and Ezekiel are commissioned to do their prophetic work. So Paul, a prophet, is to do his work, much like Ezekiel and Jeremiah did theirs. And so he's trying to provide similar sort of parallels to what we saw from those guys. This even more so mirrors the commission of the servant of the Lord from Isaiah chapter 42, verse 1 through 7. This is not only showing the commissioning of Paul, or pointing to that, but also to all Christian witnesses to be the servant's commission, which we also had already saw back in chapter 13 of this book, verse 47, where it said, I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may be able to bring salvation to the ends of the earth. So just as what we see here is just as Jesus, the servant, was to open the eyes of the blind and turn their darkness into light, so is Paul. And so are all of those who follow the servant, of course, being Jesus, the servant. Paul will continue this message in his epistles to the churches. If you look at Colossians chapter 1, verses 12 through 14, he tells the churches in Colossae how God the Father has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saint in light, has delivered us from the domination of darkness, and transformed us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption for forgiveness of sins. He is speaking here to Jews and Gentiles. He is providing, for the most part, the summary of the blessing that Jesus provided to him, pointing him in the right direction of the work he is to do with the Gentiles. Paul continues that message as he continues to go through all this. Believing Gentiles were to have an equal and rightful share in the heritage of God's holy people. He writes this in his letters over and over and over again in Galatia and Ephesus. He does that. If you want evidence of that, go to Galatians 1:16, and then you can go to Ephesians 2:19 as well as 3:1 through 10 to be able to see how he continued to do that. We can wonder here if King Agrippa had grasped what Paul was saying. Remember, he is the Jewish king, and he knows the ways and the traditions of the Jews, but does he understand the work that is to be done with the Gentiles? And I would have to say he probably doesn't, and that probably leads a little bit of confusion for him, because early on, and even to this day, you could argue that our Jewish brothers and sisters are either not willing to admit or do not understand or have not fully seen what Paul was teaching to actually happen. And so that's just kind of part of what we do here. But you have to remember, Paul's job was to let the entire world know that Jews and Gentiles were now on equal footing, that the faith that was once, you could even say that the faith that seemed to be reserved only for the Jews are now, and through the resurrection of Jesus, is now, and the power of the Holy Spirit, is now available to everyone, all people. And he goes through that in his epistles, in a couple of them, and he continues to speak of this as a truth. And it truly is something that is very important to his work. It's like it all kind of is based on that. He's made that point before. If the resurrection is not real, then none of this is real. Why are we doing this? I'll just go home. But he also makes it very clear that it isn't just for the Jewish people anymore. It is for everyone. It has always been pointing in that direction. This is not a new construct that the way or the sect or this new group is coming up with. It has always been pointing in that direction. Even if you go as far back as the Canaanites and the other early nations that Abraham met and that Moses dealt with and that other leaders of the church were dealing with, it was all pointing to this direction of Jews and Gentiles, all people of God's creation, being able to know who God is, or having the ability to know who the one true God is. So verses 19 through 20, let's just read through 23 here. So King Agrippa, I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision, but he kept declaring both to those of Damascus first and also Jerusalem and throughout all the region of Judea and even to the Gentiles that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds appropriate to repentance. For this reason, some Jews seized me in the temple and I tried to put me to death. So as having obtained help from God, I stand to this day testifying both to small and great, stating nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place, that the Christ was to suffer, and that by reason of his resurrection and from the dead, he'd be the first to proclaim light both to the Jewish people and the Gentiles. Look at here real quick to see what that says. So interesting here, this other translation, I know I turn to it periodically, it's the Net Bible, that the Christ was to suffer and to be the first to rise from the dead to proclaim light both to our people, which of course in the Greek is Jewish, is the people, but is here also translated as the Jewish people, and to the Gentiles. And this is all, of course, like I've said before, very much rooted in the Old Testament prophetic scripture of what this means. And I think sometimes we overlook it and bypass this or take it very lightly, but it's always pointed in this direction. Some people don't see the importance of the Old Testament, but it clearly is important because it shows that it is all people who are to know the power of God. In verses 19 and 20, when Paul hears the words, I am Jesus, Paul's life was forever transformed at that point, as he knew now who his Lord and Master was. This is more, the know here is an in-depth, a deep understanding, an emotional connection. It's more than just a fact. That word is used multiple times throughout the New Testament in the Greek, where knowledge, to know or to know, is two very different words. And depending on the Greek word that you see there will determine if it is a factual knowledge or is it something more deep and emotional understanding, knowing of who someone is. His proclamation here begins claiming Jesus is the Son of God in Damascus. We see that in chapter 9, verse 20. And then in Jerusalem with the Hellenistic Jews in chapter 9, verse 29. So Jesus being the Son of God, again, for all people. From there we'll go to many other Jewish regions, but mainly to the Gentiles, as that was where he has been called. And we'll see him, of course, he goes to synagogues. If you remember, as we've gone through this book, he goes into synagogues and he speaks with the Jewish people. He has nothing against that, but he also knows that there's Jewish Christians or Messianic Jews. He also knows that there's Gentiles who are now Christians who will also venture into the synagogue. But from there, of course, he expands out and works with the home churches as well. We'll see through Paul's ministry to the Gentiles his insistence that is not because of works, but through faith that men and women receive the saving grace of God. And there's always been a little bit of debate about faith and works, which is well beyond the context of today, but something that Paul does absolutely emphasize and continues to emphasize is the insistence of faith for people to be able to come to God and see his grace and mercy. One other thing I want to point out there is I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision. Verse 19, that goes back to where he said other times where his conscience has always been clean. He's always done what he said he was going to do. He has not backtracked. He has not gone sideways. He's not taken back on a message or a word. He's been consistent. And that's what we're seeing, at least my understanding of what we're seeing here. Okay, jumping to verse 21. Based on Paul's new life and his work with the Gentiles, the Jews became upset and tried to seize him while he's in the temple, if you go remember that. That believed was caused by the Asian Jews, that are Jews most likely out of Ephesus, had come down to do that. And because of this that we see here in this verse is the ministry Paul was doing amongst the Gentiles. Because of the work that he was doing amongst the Gentiles, they were wanting the Jews, especially the Asian Jews at this point, were wanting to take Paul out because how he was negatively affecting what they believed in. All right. Remember the rumor was that he had profaned the temple by bringing a Gentile into the temple, which we know was forbidden. And this was based on the fact that he was with Gentiles in Jerusalem with an assumption that he brought them into the temple. No one actually ever saw him. There are no eyewitnesses. Remember, there's been multiple trials. No eyewitnesses who actually said that they saw him in the temple, the area of the temple that Gentiles aren't allowed to go to with Paul. So it was all hearsay. No eyewitnesses ever came up to that. The Jews are upset because he is disrupting their way of life. They are not upset that he is saying that what the prophets taught has been fulfilled by God, but instead that the Jewish law was no longer relevant or binding in regards to separating the Jews from the Gentiles. The Jews really were thinking that, well, okay, this is our God. You guys, Gentile guys, you have your own God. Don't cheapen our God with your cheap gods. We know your little gods made out of metals and wood and things and cork and related things, but we don't want that. We have our one and only God, and so they don't like the idea now that there is equal footing between Jews and Gentiles. So we could assume is a major reason that they do not really appreciate each other, or at least the Jews do not appreciate the Gentiles. Of course, then the Gentiles didn't really appreciate the Jews, but anyways. We assume that Festus, with the help of Agrippa, got his ideas together here and was able to send Paul off to Rome based on what we saw. Verses 22 through 23, Paul gives his conclusion of his account, focused on the fact that he is just doing what he was told based on the words of Jesus, as well as what the prophets had said and said would happen, how this would all play out. As he has mentioned before, he has remained consistent in his message and has been loyal to the faith of Israel. He has just continued moving the faith forward. He hasn't brought in a new religion. This is not a new idea. This is something that has been since Abraham, and even argued before then, is something that has been consistent message coming from God. So it's not like he's creating anything new here. He's not making anything up. He is just sharing what Moses and the prophets had predicted what would happen and how it would all play out. I'd like to take it as far back as Abraham, but some people would only take it back as far as Moses. Either way, that's what it's the direction it's been going in that way for a long time. It's said that Luke left out Old Testament text here that Paul would have been used to make in his case. Most likely, what we see here is a summary of what Paul was able to say. And the reason that is believed is because Paul had a huge and very influential audience, and he wanted to just do a quick overview. It was more of what we're seeing here as a summary, and that was typical for authors back then, to take the highlights of the speech and then to summarize them. But also the idea of not being able to see the Old Testament text was mainly because Luke, the writer here, we believe to be the author, took those out because people already knew those, that didn't add to the the information here because of the story Luke is trying to say. But just to keep in mind, Old Testament text, quoting Old Testament text, Torah text, would have been typical in early Christian teaching to group together appropriate text to help explain how prophets had pointed at this moment. So kind of like preaching is today, good preaching is today, where you grab a good amount of contextual text and then be able to explain and point forward to who God is. Luke provides a summary of evidence that Paul did, like I said, which is typical. He asks these questions that are very the musts you see here I think in 23. And again, I think it depends on your translation. The must is the must of God's predetermined plan, made known through the words of the prophets. And so that's what must. So for example, must the Messiah suffer? Must he rise from the dead? Must he bring the light of salvation to the people of Israel and the Gentile nations? Yes, that has all been predetermined by God for that to happen. And Paul is telling them that story. Looking at the next set of verses 24 through 29, while Paul was saying this, in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, "Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad. Mad, mad, I say." But Paul said, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice, for this has not been done in a corner." That's a very interesting way to say that. Very interesting. Yeah. It's interesting. Okay. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. And Agrippa replied to Paul, "In a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian." And Paul said, "I would wish to God that whether in a short or long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains." And so you can see that verse 29 there is a very good summary of what Paul's that's not his motivation, but is what his ultimate hope is that everyone will hear the truth of what he is saying. Here, Paul, Festus, and Agrippa have a bit of discussion like we see here in verses 24 through 29. It seems to be a little heated, maybe slightly tense. You maybe get a terse response here from Agrippa. And of course, it is Paul's wish, as you saw here, that all people who are listening would be able to see the light in which he saw. The light here, of course, being Jesus, and be able to help everyone be able to kind of see that way forward. Festus is, for the most part, his brain explodes, not literally, but he is unable to process all the stuff Paul is saying. It being so inconsistent with how the Romans processed the world. The Romans did not see the world in this way. Of course, they had multiple deities, also referred to as polytheistic, and they saw the world in a completely different world. They didn't even think gods like them, especially Greeks did not think their gods like them. They thought, you can go back to the Babylonians. So it's kind of an odd thing, first of all, to have one God, and one God who actually cares, one God who actually loves his people. So it'd be very odd for Festus to hear this, even though he may have been exposed to it a time or two, but it doesn't seem like that often. In verses 25 through 27, what the governor thought was madness, Paul thought made perfect sense. It's kind of funny how our different worldviews bring different conclusions to what is being said. Paul understands here and explains he is not making this up. What he is saying about a resurrected Messiah is well known and believed by the Jewish faithful. It's not something that he just made up in a corner or in a dark corner or kind of in a hovel, sitting there writing all these conspiracies. It is all stuff that is consistent with the Jewish faith. People witnessed the resurrection. The ministry and death of Jesus was well documented and common knowledge among the Jews. And so there wasn't any argument that you could make against the resurrection. Well, you could, and people did, but there was plenty of evidence that Jesus was resurrected and was among the Jews after his resurrection. Ultimately, anyone who believed what the prophets taught and compared that with what they knew about Jesus would have to acknowledge what Paul was saying was true. I mean, that was just kind of the logical explanation or the logical conclusion from that. It is Paul's hope that Agrippa would see what he saw regarding the prophets, and if he did, there was no other conclusion than what Paul was teaching was true. So if Agrippa can see this, which he's trying to get Agrippa on his side, and Agrippa doesn't seem to really want to do that. He almost seems in verse 28 to be embarrassed by Paul's appeal. So he may have been interested in what Paul was saying from an informative point of view, but was not really interested in applying what Paul was saying, and I think that's probably true for a lot of people, this is fascinating stuff that you're talking about, but I really don't want to live in a way that would actually reflect what you're saying. And so that's probably what Agrippa was doing here, because he kind of had the good thing going for him and his especially special friend Bernice. Agrippa should have easily been able to pick up on all this, and it amazes Paul that Agrippa is so dense, at least is kicking against the goad, much like Paul had done. And you can kind of look at it here this way. But I think Agrippa is in quite a fix when you really think about, as he's trying to both appease the Roman leaders, so that would be Festus in this case, and then of course on up the line, as well as stay on the good side of the Jews. So not the Messianic Jews, but the more traditional Jews. And he would want to say he did not believe the prophet. He would not want to say he did not believe the prophets, but he could not, because that would mean he would then upset the Jews, and he would lose his already weak standing with the Jews. So he was in quite a fix. He was politically astute enough to play the Christian card by telling Paul that as a Jew, he certainly cannot become part of this new sect, because he is a true traditional Jew. Paul was not going to manipulate him into following this crazy logic, so-called logic of Paul's. And it seems like Agrippa was going to hold fast to the power players at the time, which was, of course, the high priest of the temple and his cronies, and then, of course, the Roman governor and his group, entourage of people. In verse 29 here, we see it to be Paul's hope that, again, that even though it seems that nobody is listening or really hearing what he has to say, that they would someday understand what he was saying, and that people would follow the Jewish Messiah. And he points to his chains here, and it's very interesting that he does that. It is hoped that they could all be the same, but of course, without the chains that he is wearing, keeping him from being able to do the work that he has been called to do. So I bet that was a very poignant moment, just to kind of imagine what Paul was dealing with and what Paul was saying, and how Agrippa was not willing to step up and hear the words of Paul. Last three verses of chapter 26. The king stood up, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with him, and when they had gone aside, they began talking to one another, saying, "This man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment." And Agrippa said to Festus, "This man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." You could read that line, that quote there at the end, in a couple of different ways. We could take here, of course, that all that are listening here are in agreement that this man deserves not imprisonment or death, but unfortunately he has appealed to Caesar, and Caesar he should go. Well, here's the dealio with all this. All of the audience are ready to be relieved of this situation. So Agrippa, Bernice, Festus, and their entourages meet and determine that Paul is innocent. And if Festus said he had gone mad, even if Festus had said he'd gone mad, there's nothing against the law to go mad. And it seems like they're relieved of this, because Paul was bringing the gospel, and the gospel is convicting, and the gospel makes you think about who you are and who you are in God's creation, who God made you to be. And there's a lot of things the gospel does, but it's very convicting. And that was probably starting to, we got to get away from this. It's getting pretty uncomfortable. And so they take their entourage out and have this conversation. Like I said, there's nothing illegal about being insane, of course, unless you hurt, murder, or do something to somebody or something. We can assume that Agrippa had no issues with helping Festus frame the report after hearing the testimony of Paul. He was probably hoping that Paul would go away too. That way he would not have to hear him again. Early readers of this would see Agrippa's words about to appeal to Caesar as a bit sinister. So those who had read this probably 1st century, 2nd century. For the most part, the appeal had removed any hope of Paul ever being set free again, as they would be familiar with the now not so friendly Caesar at that time, or emperor at that time, who was Nero, who was at times early on, relatively friendly to the Christians, but it eventually was persecuted them quite heavily. We could say that, but then again, maybe we're just reading too much into this, which always can happen, because sometimes when we read too much of this, we read too much into it. We can instead just read this as the appeal has put himself into a new position in relationship to the Roman law, and the course for citizens must now be followed. So he is already declared his path. There's nothing that we can do to alter it in any way. Well, look at that. 26 chapters down, 2 to go. We're going to start chapter 27 right now. Chapter 27, just verses 1 to 12. It's going to just be a quick walk as we do this. We're going to start with verses 1 through 8. And if I get really crazy and don't yawn too much, I'm going to go all the way to 13, possibly 12. So chapter 27 of Acts, verse 1. Notice the first thing that you see here, and I'll get a little bit more into in a second, is that the we narrative is back. Not we as in small, but we as in Luke has now joined the party again. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, who we don't know who that is, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. Then from there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. I hate contrary winds. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty and arrived at Sindius, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Let's keep on going. Verse 9. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. So Paul admonishes. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. It's somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And 13, just for kicks. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed an anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. And it's great when Luke shows back up and he starts telling us the story of the trips. There's a lot of detail here that we don't really even need to know about, but it's fascinating that he added pretty much the step-by-step journey of the first few days of their trip to Rome. It's fascinating. I love this sort of thing. I think it's just really, really interesting to see that and to see how this all plays out and how this trip goes and how Paul's treated. Anyways, Paul is now beginning his long and arduous journey of sea and a land voyage. There'll be some land along the way here as well, so that he can make it to Rome and appeal to Caesar. Luke provides a significant amount of detail in this trip, much more than you would typically see in other parts of the Bible, which, like I said, I am just fascinated with. It provides a very good overview of what traveling was like by sea in that time period. It was hard work, and typically a whole lot faster one way than the other, unlike our ships of today, which can kind of beat the wind, or at least go significantly faster than the wind. This is something that was not really able to be done back then. We have to view this voyage through the eyes of the ancient Greeks. Luke is not himself a sailor, so he borrows terminology and literature from works like Homer's Odyssey, which was written about the same time that this was written. It was typical for ancient seafaring accounts to have a storm and a wreck at sea. Kind of think about Jonah, the story of Jonah. He had a storm. And this was the type of storytelling that continued for centuries. Remember, Luke is telling us a story. Now, it doesn't take away from being historical, but he as a writer of that time, he is using the tools that writers of that time used to write stories, to tell a story. We can compare this to other Mediterranean, because they are in the Mediterranean Sea, ship voyage stories in the Old Testament. Like I said, Jonah would be one, but there's many other stories that are very popular and famous, such as Odyssey that happened in the Mediterranean Sea, and they had a very similar sort of pattern that we're seeing here. So again, remember, there's a certain form of literature being written here. There's a certain style of literature that was happening during that time. There's a certain form and function to it. And again, like I said, it does not take away from the historical significance of this voyage. There are some over the centuries who will take the story in chapter 27 as an allegory of life's journeys, as well as the journey of the church. Nothing absolutely wrong with that, but there's more than an allegory. You can use it as an allegory. There's a lot of historical, good factual stories that can be used also as allegories, especially when it comes to travel and journeys and adventures. But that was not Luke's intent for this to be an allegory. It was to be a historical overview of the trip that Paul would make along with his comrades from Caesarea to Rome. You can pick up, of course, significant spiritual and moral lessons through this. And Luke does that as he writes all of Acts, but he portrays Paul in a way that provides moral and spiritual lessons as well. In this story that we've just read the scripture over, the verses over, we see that Paul has become not that he's become, but that he is shown here by Luke to be a practical and reasonable leader, while everything around him seems to be devolving into chaos. It is believed that Luke provides all the details to show that it is through divine action Paul is able to make it to Rome, even with all the extreme obstacles along the way. If you recall the story, before we haven't got there yet, but he gets, of course, they shipwreck, and then he gets bitten by a snake, and just nothing good happens, but he seems to survive it all because it seems to be God's intent for him to get there. All right, so we'll first look at our verses 1 to 5. Phase one of the trip is from Caesarea to Myra, or is it Myra? No, it's not. It's why am I thinking it's not that? Myrta. I thought it was Myrta. Anyways, no, it's Myra. Sorry. I don't know why I was thinking Myrta. It's not. It's Myra. Another city. Anyways, so verse 1, we return, of course, like I said, to the we narrative, which left us back in chapter 21, verse 18. We are uncertain where Luke was during this time. Of course, he's written everything since chapter 21, but that was probably secondhand information from people who were more closely around Paul. Maybe it could be even stuff that he witnessed Paul doing, but just notice that he does not use we in any of this from chapter 21 till this point here. Most likely it's been about 2 years time period from chapter 21 to 28, 20, well, where are we right now? Chapter 27. But it can be assumed that he was in Caesarea or around in that region, collecting information and working with the church there, and of course supporting Paul in some capacity, as he would be allowed to do for Paul as a prisoner in the status in which he was a prisoner. Though he had not been with Paul in the stories that we have heard since chapter 21, it seems that Paul was allowed to travel with Luke and others to Rome. The centurion Julius was based on his name received, or his ancestor probably received, when he became a citizen whenever Julius Caesar was in power. So this Julius is the one to take Paul on this journey. The Augustan court that we see here, or cohort, meaning his imperial majesty's court, an honor given to many cohorts of auxiliary troops. It was very typical for army soldiers to be captains of ships, much like Julius is here. Well, let's just explain why. Based on what we see here, most likely this cohort at least was probably based out of Syria somehow. We're not certain about the status of Julius, but we do know that he was in charge and was able to take sail on a ship from the Alexandrian grain fleet. And most likely he could have been an officer in charge of supervising the transportation of grain, which is, of course, is why he's able to get on these ships. He'd be known as a frumentarius, is who this person would be known as, and they had, because it was so significant of keeping grain flowing literally from Egypt to the rest of Rome, in order to make sure that Rome could continue to remain powerful, because Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire at that time. Either way, they're on a grain ship, or eventually will be on a larger grain ship, to Rome. And since Paul was heading that way, after his appeal, Paul was assigned to be aboard that ship. So coincidence, divine intervention. Anyways, it was convenient at the time for Paul to take that ship along with some other folks to head on out of town and make their way to Rome. We can assume here that the port they left from was the Caesarea port. Otherwise, Luke would have reported a specific port, as he was accustomed to details in his when he talks about the trips they were on. So it was more likely a port out of Caesarea. The seaport from which the ship was from was Adramyttium, a seaport in the region of Mysia, which is in northwest Asia Minor. The ship, not the eventual grain ship that we will be seeing, was a coasting ship, so it would stay relatively close to shore and jump from port to port until arriving in Myra, to where it was the hope to find a larger grain ship so that they be more of a go across the sea. It may have been the hope of the sailors and Julius alike to make it to Myra in time to get on the larger ship before the sailing season was over. Otherwise, they would have to take the land route to Rome over the Egnatian Way, which Paul had been on parts of it already earlier on in Acts. But that, as we'll see here, isn't the case, or the route that they take. Aristarchus, like I said, was most likely someone who had been able to get a ride back to his home in Thessalonica, so he jumped off before they boarded the grain ship. Then again, there's other viewpoints that he may have remained on the ship or with them, and this is based on the epistles of the Colossians and the book of Philemon. He was in Paul's company when Paul wrote these books, as he was referenced in both of them. And Philemon, what I said earlier? I said, okay. Anyways, 24, and then Colossians 4:10. Some would argue that Aristarchus did indeed take the full voyage with Paul, along with Luke, allowing for the we to continue. We're not sure who else was with Paul and Luke. Could have been a few other believers or helpers. And anyways, some would even go as far to say, this is based on how Paul was being treated, which was very well, that Aristarchus and that Luke were his servants or slaves, which gave Paul a significant amount of street cred with the centurion, allowing for the respect that Paul received when he was on the ship. It is improbable, but alas, we can always speculate expanding stories in this way, that they were servants or slaves. The other view could be that Aristarchus just paid to take the voyage, so he's like a typical, he paid the fee, paid for the ticket, and that Luke came on as the ship's doctor. So there's different viewpoints. No one tells us, but we can just kind of guess and assume based on context of what happened. Jimmy there into verse 3. After the first day at sea, they put in at Sidon, which is a metropolis in Phoenicia, about 69 miles north of Caesarea. The centurion shows his kindness to Paul and allows him to go ashore to see his brethren there in the Christian community. And some would say this community formed after the killing of Stephen, where a lot of people took off and headed that way and formed up a church there. Julius, we know, is not daft enough to allow Paul to go alone, so it is assumed that he's assigned a detail to go with Paul, probably someone that Paul was attached to, either by some sort of chain or some other way, so that he cannot just take off or people could take him away. Once leaving Sidon there in verse 4, they sailed east and north of Cyprus on the lee or the shelter, as the winds during that time of the year came out of the west. We are in the summer months here at this point. If they were to go the opposite direction, it'd be a much easier trip and a direct route passing west of Cyprus. It seems Luke makes this note as a way to show that he knows they were now taking a different route than they did 2 years prior, when they did, of course, were heading towards Caesarea. It was a little different route because the wind was at their back and it was a whole lot easier to do. Verse 5, there still remained there a large portion of the open sea for them to cross between Cyprus and the south coast of Asia Minor. They ended up in Asia Minor well to the east and then worked their way west slowly with the help of land winds and a western current, so there was some help from wind blowing off of the land. They could only take a couple miles at a time, and then they would set anchor in a sheltered cove or just some sort of shelter from the wind, and until the westerly winds were more favorable for them. by doing this little journey, they ended up about 3.5 miles southwest of Myra at the port of Andriake, a chief port of the Imperial Grain Service, which would make a lot of sense of why he'd be on a grain ship heading to Rome, and why this centurion that was with them was someone who was in charge of getting grain from Egypt to Rome. Verses 6 through 8. Upon their arrival, they find the grain ship and transfer everyone over to the new ship and take off for the island of Crete, much like you know in Good Morning Vietnam. We have come to the end of the first part of the journey at this point. There in verse 6, the grain fleet that they found would haul grain from Egypt to Rome. The boat they board had left Alexandria and was on its way to Rome, so Alexandria, Egypt. And during this period, like I said, Egypt was the place that created all the grain and made all the grain, also known as the breadbasket there of Rome. Also have to remember, grain was not only keep the soldiers going and keep the armies going in Rome, but it provided for stability. So when you have food, people are less likely to riot. When you have plenty of resources for people to use and to live off of and to even possibly thrive off of, a lot less chances of instability. So Rome, as we know, the Romans took stability very serious, and so they knew that keeping the grain flowing would keep stability there in Rome. The owners of these ships would be citizens, but they had special recognition from the Roman Empire, and I guess you could say were contractors to the Roman Empire and would have a special status with them. The westerly winds that we see here were allowing for a very slow trip, which was typical for that time of year, allowing for many ports to be established along the route for ships to wait out the stronger winds. And so this was something that they would just hop from port to port as they went. Most all the ships did not have a compass at that time, and the ships were not built to fight the wind, so they would not hold north until they would have to hold north until they made it to Asia Minor, which was more favorable for sea travel. Due to a few reasons, the westerly current, as well as the elevation of the mountains along the land to be viewable from a great distance, made a lot of sense for them to take this route. So it was a very mountainous region which they were sailing along, so they would be able to keep an eye on the land and what was going on there, and then that westerly current would help them as well. Verse 7, as they're continuing to sail slowly, it was a hard going for several days until they finally reached Cnidus, a port of the Carian promontory of, Triopium? Yep, is where they end up, which was a place where Egyptians' ships frequently stopped. They had two choices, either stay at the port or to wait for favorable winds. The two harbors had plenty of accommodation for them to remain for a time, so it wasn't like they had to leave or they didn't have space. Their other options was to go forward and head to the eastern extremity off the island of Crete, and after rounding it, sail under the protection of the island along the south coast. It seems this is what they chose based on the text. They were not able to stay at the port, so they went on. They're in verse 7. So they continue their difficult sailing. They're in verse 8. They coast along the south of Crete. Was not, of course, easy for them there. With the wind blowing from the northwest, they continued until they hit a small cove or bay known as Fair Havens, even known as Fair Havens to this day. It has a more Greek-like name, but we'll refer to it as Fair Havens. This was their first good option after coming around Cape Salmon, so they put in there and waited for the wind to change. If they decide to stay there, there was a city of Lasea, not Colassa, but Lasea, which had plenty of accommodations for them to stay over the winter if they chose to do so. But it seems like that is not their choice. In verses 9 through 12, Paul gives a little advice, but we see that he is rejected. They have remained in Fair Havens, hoping for a more favorable wind. It seems they know now they will not make it to Italy before winter. They've kind of come to that full realization. It is typical for mid-September to mid-November when it is dangerous to try and make the trip. So that was about the time period they're in. And no one would even attempt a trip like this once you got into mid-November until winter was over. So whenever that was, they would not even attempt the trip. The fast that Luke refers to here is the dates where within the fasting dates or right after the fasting date of Yom, I can't, why am I not even saying it? Yom Kippur. It would have been so in AD 59, which the fast happened in AD 59, October 5th. So we know we're in October. It could have been not between 57 to 62 because the fast was earlier in those years. So it had to be 59. So it is 59 unless Luke, of course, miswrote it, which we don't see a reason why it would. They must have attended the fast while they were in Fair Havens. So now you can tell people about that, about what fast did Paul and Luke attend when they stayed in Fair Havens on Paul's trip to Rome. Now you know what the fast was. So they're spending at least until February in whatever area they end up. So when we see the 3 months in Malta, it was roughly November to January. We'll read about Malta here in a minute or next time. This means they left Fairhaven around mid-October, so they're really cutting it close. In verse 10, Paul had experienced a shipwreck in the past. If you were to turn to his epistle to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 11:25, so he did not really want to repeat that. He knew it would be dangerous to leave Fairhaven, so he offered up his advice. Though he was not a sailor, he was someone who had experienced poor sailing conditions and a shipwreck. He is concerned not only for the cargo, which was the wheat, which we know is extremely important, but also for the life of the people on board. You will see more of that there in verse 21, and he'll remind them again in verse 22. And fortunately, we know that lives were not lost, but Paul is concerned that that could happen. It seems there was some sort of leadership council there aboard the ship who would meet about this. And based on Paul's expensive travel, it seems like he was part of the group. That's why he was able to have a say here. We can assume he went to the centurion since they had a good relationship to express his concern to him as well as to the group. You may see it as the pilot and the captain. Other translations may see this as the helmsman and the ship owner are in agreement to disagree with Paul's assessment of the situation and determine there's better port further west. Maybe they want to get a jump on the situation, or maybe they have better restaurants and pubs at the next further west port. We don't get what the reasoning is, but it seems Luke is a bit surprised that the centurion goes along with the other two, which helps add a bit of authenticity to the telling of an eyewitness account for you to be able to get that sort of emotion. Because you're all dying to know, there is a hierarchy of the boat for that time period. The helmsman chooses the sailors, and the ship owner chooses the helmsman. The ship owner was typically the captain of the ship, so that's why we see captain here or ship owner. But at the time, he is contracted out to the Roman government on the grain ship, which would mean the centurion would be in charge as a representative of Rome. So you could say the centurion was truly the one in charge, and so he'd be the one who'd make the final decision of where they would end up going. Final verse. It's exciting. Man, I can barely contain myself. So it seems all but Paul and the narrator agree that there is a better harbor just up the coast from Fair Havens. It seemed that they thought the harbor of Phoenix would be a better place to stop based on the commodities that would be provided there, like I said. And also possibly is better protected from the elements. Remember, they're staying in the winters. The winters were harsh, especially that are on the sea. So they probably were looking for a little bit more comfortable place. Phoenix, we know, was a Cretan port facing northwest and southwest. It's so bad, so unfortunate that Cretan has become a derogatory term. But anyways, it is Cretan, what we see here. In the 6th century AD, there was a significant earthquake causing the coast to tilt from west to east there at that port. And it seems to have closed off on those two inlets that Luke describes here. So if you were to look today, you would not see both the inlets, or even since the 6th century, you wouldn't be able to see both the inlets. But Luke is referring to that here. Well, on that bit of information and that factual tidbit, we'll stop there. We'll start at chapter 27, verse 13. And we'll go at least through to probably to the end of chapter 27. And I bet what we'll do, gosh, I don't want to do this, but it looks like just based on timing and everything, we have 2 more weeks of this. We'll go through, not that I'm not enjoying this, it's just we've been doing this since July, is through verse 44 there in Acts 27, and then start at chapter 28, where they become safe at Malta, and then Paul eventually arrives at Rome, and we become unhindered there. and we wrap up. All right. Thank you. Have a good week.